Before we begin tonight's Fireside Chats, and in respect of National Reconciliation Week, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we are all standing and living on. I am currently on land belonging to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge that we are all currently on different lands of different nations. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. So, hi everyone, welcome. I'm Eric from the marketing and events team of the Asian Australian Project. I will be your MC tonight, and we all at the AAP team welcome you to the Fireside Chats, the LGBTQIA plus edition. In case you're new to what we do, we are a non-for-profit initiative run by and for young Asian Australians. Just for reference, we define Asian Australian as anyone with Asian ethnic heritage who lives in or has lived in Australia. Our events are open to everyone, and especially for tonight, will be valuable for everyone, no matter their background. So just some housekeeping before we start. Firstly, this event is being recorded, so we can share it to other people who might not be able to attend today. Secondly, please ensure your mics are on mute if they aren't already. And lastly, we'll go through audience questions at the end of the event. If you do have a question you want me to ask to the panelists at the end, please submit that through Slido. You can either type in www.slido.com or scan the QR code on Angela's cover photo here at AAP. On the next few slides, we'll have login details on the bottom of the slides. Our Slido password is FC3LGBTQIA, and you can vote for your favorite questions throughout the night. And in terms of house rules, this is a safe space and a place of learning. I would like to inform you all with a content warning. There may be mention of potentially upsetting topics around mental illness and disability discrimination. So if you are not comfortable with these, please proceed with caution. If you need support, please see the links to support services on this slide. And any use of inflammatory or discriminatory language will be cause for removal from the event. We endeavor to use respectful language and agreeing to disagree. Also, unsolicited messages to others in this event are discouraged. If you have any questions not regarding the talk, please contact either Sarah, Michelle, Humphrey, or Angela, our AAP team. They have AAP next to their name, so you can find them out. Since this event is being recorded, please don't do anything you wouldn't want recorded or share information that you wouldn't in public. Also, if you prefer to, you can type your pronouns next to your name by pressing the rename tag in your settings. And if addressing someone who has not directly stated their pronouns, gender-neutral language should be used to refer to them, for example, they or them. And in the case that this event runs a little bit over time, you are more than welcome to stick around. So, in celebration of International Pride Month, we want to celebrate and highlight our queer Asian Australians, take a deep dive into our world, and explore how we navigate culture and sexuality. Firstly, a primer on the LGBTQIA plus spectrum. If you aren't familiar with the abbreviations, each letter stands for an identity, like L for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, Q for queer or questioning, I for intersex, A for asexual, agender or ally, plus many more identities and individuals who may not identify with labels or prefer not to use them. So, both gender and sexuality are often referred to on a spectrum. Here are some definitions if you need to know the distinction between each. To clarify, gender encapsulates your identity and expression. Sexuality is who you are physically or emotionally attracted to. Gender and sexuality overlap into very fluid combinations. For example, I identify as a cisgender gay man, and I express as both feminine and masculine behavior depending on who I'm with. And I am physically and emotionally attracted to other men, but unfortunately they aren't to me. So Sheetal, I see you. Allies in this call, hi, hello. If you are unfamiliar with this territory, feel free to submit some questions. We see you and we appreciate you. I also want to disclaim that myself and the panelists have our experiences in the LGBTQIA world, but do not fully represent the entire community, as every individual is a complex human being with unique experiences that shape their being. So, with that all out of the way, this is an introductory session to the wonderful and colorful world of queer life, and we'll only be able to cover so many topics in 90 minutes. However, I have no doubt in my mind that some of the topics we will discuss will be common to all Asian Australians. So coming out of this, I encourage everyone to spread love and look after each other in the Asian Australian community. So without further ado, let's introduce our panelists. If you don't mind stating what you do, your preferred pronouns, and the organizations you represent, we'll start with Giancarlo.
Oh, lucky first person. Hi, everyone. My name is Giancarlo. I use he, they pronouns. I must admit and apologize I'm at the upfront that I'm not feeling the best. So apologies if I'm coming across a bit too nasal or otherwise a bit slower than I normally would be. But for those who don't know, I am the president of the Australian LGBT Multicultural Council. They are a national peak body which represents the people who from multicultural, multi-faith backgrounds who identify as LGBTQI. And so in that regard, we represent a lot of diverse communities, particular communities of colour that are quite often marginalised in the conversations around mainstream LGBTQI issues. In terms of myself, I like to call myself a lapsed lawyer. I'm now working in policy for the national peak body known as People with Disability Australia for Disability, and so I head up the policy and advocacy team there as well as being president. And so I'm here to talk to you also about the intersection around being queer, disabled, and from a culturally diverse background as well. I'm also from a few other organisations which I won't go into, but I thought I'd share that a bit about myself. In terms of my story, it's, gosh, where do I start? I guess it's the story of 3 coming outs. It is probably a really good way of starting off with it. Like I originally identified as a cis male who was gay, but then I think that was my first coming out. First coming out happened when I was about 14, which is quite early for a lot of young queers, and you know, I thought that was a really, in retrospect, it was quite easy relative to the other two coming outs, and that for me may not be the experience of other people, but for me, that experience coming out as gay first was, as you can expect, a very traumatic time. It likely led to new experiences and to new relationships, which I'm forever grateful for. But as I said earlier, it kind of powers to the other 2 coming outs. For me, my disability then became my 3rd coming out. I have a psychosocial disability, which means that sometimes my ability to participate is impaired, depending on how the disability affects me in my daily life. Sometimes it can affect me for 2 weeks. Sometimes it can affect me for 2 years, in which it has in the past, where I wasn't able to work for 2 years. And so that itself was quite a much harder coming out because psychosocial is so invisible. When people think of disability, they think of, you know, a person in a wheelchair or someone who's got cerebral palsy or something that's a lot more visible. And I never saw myself with that label until for a very long time. And so being able to call myself a disabled person was actually much harder than being queer and gay. And the third one, which was even harder, which is probably the most recent coming out, is my gender identity. I identify as non-binary, and I said earlier I identified as a cis gay man, but that's changed over the last few years because interestingly, it's strongly within my culture. Today, I hope we talk about racism and what it means to be racist in a queer context. Because for me, the identity of being a non-binary person is intrinsically linked to my experience of racism, and it was through reclaiming my culture I was able to identify with this term known as bakla. For those who are Filipino in the room, bakla is kind of like a third gender in Filipino culture. similar to say the Hijras in Hindu culture or other cultures. A lot of other cultures would have similar notions of gender, and so that notion of gender for me really stuck out to me because of my experience of gender growing up never quite matched to the ones I was assigned at birth. And so for me, that was a really, really surprisingly, how would I put this? Harmonizing time, because I was healing from experiences of racism. I was healing from experiences of I guess in a lot of ways patriarchy and sexism, and so that for me was quite interesting as a process that I've compared to the other two processes, and at times still on, and I really would encourage the conversation tonight to talk about what that means as well for people, because while I may present very masculine to people, I do that because it's safe for me to do so, and I do it for work as well, and there's a lot of other reasons why I do that. And so for me, that's really, the story of my three coming outs, and I'm really excited to share that with you all. And I'm looking forward to having conversations with the others on the panel, because I know most of them and they're all bloody awesome. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Let's actually loop back in on that on your coming outs later. Sheetal, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tough one to follow. My name's Sheetal. Pronouns are she and her. I wear a few different hats. So I am a lawyer by qualification, and I call myself an advocate by choice. And the reason I do so is because I actually had a very unique journey into the legal profession, and I have a background in some marketing and recruitment. And for some people, it's referred to as a second career because I did an undergraduate in Canada. So I have my own legal practice called Sheetal Legal Solutions, and it's a low bono firm, which means I charge discounted rates or subsidized rates or pro bono. And the whole purpose of that is for it to be an access to justice. So it's making legal services and legal help more accessible. And I try to service particularly the culturally and linguistically diverse and rainbow communities, or communities that are underrepresented. I'm actually starting to work more with people with diverse abilities and disabled groups as well. So that's a cool piece. So that's Sheetal Legal Solutions. I actually work with GC out for Australia. So I'm the Queensland State Director for Out for Australia. And that's an organization that's aimed at supporting early career professionals and students being their authentic self from university to their chosen career, and helping being that support and rallying organizations to support them as well. And then the third big hat that or actually third of four, one is the Diversity Collective. So I manage and have founded this organization called the Diversity Collective, and it's aimed at creating safe spaces for us to learn, grow, and heal. And I say that because when we talk about racism or anti-racism work, it can be very vulnerable space. Not only for the people that are sharing their stories, but for people who are trying to be allies to that space. So more often than not, I'm sure we've all come across situations where we want to ask the questions, but we're very afraid. And then we hear people say things like, I no longer want to talk to white people about race. And then we feel kind of apprehensive. So the Diversity Collective is creating a safe space to have those discussions. So people who are willing to share and are willing to take on that emotional labor and be remunerated for it. And then people who want to learn about that. And lastly, the hat that's brought me here is Ethnic Plus. Ethnic Plus is a not-for-profit that I co-founded with Mikara Ramsingh, and we have an amazing management committee, and I see several of the people here today. And it's about supporting diversity and championing diversity within the rainbow community. So for anyone who knows me, knows intersectionality is my jam, and that's kind of the crux of Ethnic, and again, about that allyship piece. So amongst all the different hats, you'll see the common thread is trying to foster understanding, awareness, and compassion with people who have different experiences than our own, and creating safe spaces to do that, and really championing intersectionality, because as Eric so aptly said, we are complex individuals with intersecting identities, and I like that to be the forefront. I think labels are meant for food products and other things, not necessarily for people. So I actually don't prescribe to a particular label when it comes to my sexuality. I do identify as part of the rainbow community, but and the reason why I do that is because everyone has preconceived ideas of what a particular sexuality is. So the second that I identify as a lesbian, whatever your preconceived notions of a lesbian are, comes straight to mind. So then you start seeing me through that lens as opposed to the lens of Sheetal. If I say the same thing about being gay or pansexual or polyamorous or whatever the case may be, whatever your preconceived notions are about that identity come to fore. And for me, because I've been subjected to so many labels through the course of my life, I prefer to just introduce myself as Sheetal, she, her, and the rest you can find out, and it allows me to center the identity that I want to center with you at that time. So that's me in a bit of a nutshell.
My goodness, Sheetal, I thought there were only 24 hours in a day. How do you achieve so much? Oh my God.
Showers get compromised a lot. So working from home is good because no, I'm kidding. I did shower just before.
Now,
but look, yeah, it's a juggle, and you work in the ebbs and flows. And when certain things are busier than others, you just ride that momentum.
Viewers in the call, you hear that to become successful, you need to give up showering. Lloyd, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, these acts are becoming increasingly hard to follow, I must say. So my name is Lloyd King, and I represent Tricone Australia. Thanks to AAP for having us over here. So what does Tricone Australia do, and how did I get here? So Tricone Australia is a not-for-profit social support group for queer South Asians living in Australia. So what we do is we actually have various events and small programs that showcase entire sexuality, gender identity, as well as our cultural background into various events. So one of our biggest events that we do is a queer Bollywood dance party. But also apart from that, we do have smaller shows, smaller events similar to what we do here. So I think this is an interesting opportunity to come together to talk about how cultural identity and gender and sexuality all intersect, because this is something as people of the community that we experience a lot, and there are many layers and complexities into this, which we'll be getting into later. I'm originally from India, so you might be wondering, my name Lloyd King is actually a name that I was born with. It's not an anglicized version of any name. We can blame colonialism for that. I came to Australia maybe in 2012, and I was in my own process of reconciling my sexuality with myself. And it was actually the first time when I was invited to attend one of Tricone's shows that I went to in maybe 2016, that I first felt like I was in a really safe space, because up until then I was just reconciling my sexuality and my cultural background. But now I'm suddenly in this space where there's a lot of queer South Asian men and Asian around me, and this was quite the liberating experience. So after that, I actually tried to find out more about the organization, found out more events that were coming up, and I volunteered to be part of their shows. And then eventually I found that there's actually so much to be done, not just as a volunteer, but so much work to be done in the community that we could showcase. And that's how I started to get more and more involved with the organization. And now I represent the organization as a public officer. I probably do not wear as many hats as so far as other panelists, but great to be here with great company.
Thank you, Lloyd. And Cherie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. That's a very hard act to follow, being last. I'm quite daunted by the prospect of it, but I'll give it a go. Hi, everyone. My name is Shri Molyana. I identify as a bisexual Asian woman. I am originally, so my parents are actually Indonesian, actually from two different parts of Indonesia, so from Jakarta and Bali, which meant I have sort of a Muslim heritage on my mother's side, and on my dad's side more of a Buddhist Hindu heritage. But they grew up in a very small village called Banyuwangi, which is on the very far east coast of Java, and also accessible by boat from Bali. And they moved to Australia like 35 odd years ago, or maybe a bit longer now. And I grew up in Brisbane, which was at the time, I don't know if there's anyone here from Queensland or from Brisbane, but a little area in Logan called Crestmead or Marsden. And I think that was the first time I'd really experienced racism as a kid, and I hadn't really appreciated what it was that I was experiencing. Eventually, I went to university. Similar to everybody else here, it sounds like. I studied law and commerce, did my Master's of Laws as well, ended up working. My first job was an internship at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I am today a tax partner in the practice. So I've been there for about 14 years. And I started in Brizzy. I then got to about sort of 7 or 8 years in and realised, actually, I don't know if I want to do tax anymore. I might go overseas, do something else. And at the time, I dated women at university, but I wasn't really truly out at work. And this is Brisbane, 10 odd years ago, very different place. And I met my girlfriend my now wife, but my girlfriend there, and she was also working at PwC, and we kind of got together, and it was all very secret. We didn't tell anyone. Then she moved to London. I was trying to follow her to London because that's the time of your career where everyone who has law degrees and accounting degrees, they all move to London and they do that thing. Instead, I ended up getting a role at another Big Four firm, and I walked into the partner's office and said, "Hey, I'm quitting. I'm out of here. Goodbye. I'm going to the UK." And they said, "Why are you going?" And I kind of had this, I had to kind of come out at work moment, and that was very powerful. But fortunately, really lucky. It was very uplifting, and everyone was so supportive. But they said, "Look, the role that we're going to offer you is actually not in London. It's actually New York. Would you consider taking that instead?" And I just went, "Oh, I don't know." And they said, "We'll pay for your rent. We'll pay for this. We'll pay for that." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I can't turn that down." So my Kirsten ended up moving to New York through PwC as well. And we lived there from 2015 to 2017. And then from there, I was asked to come back home and said, if you want to make partners, you got to come back to Australia. So I was like, okay, and came back to Sydney. So now we live in Sydney. And throughout that process, Kirsten, we got engaged in New York. Kirsten proposed, actually, and then we came back. I proposed back, so we both have our engagement rings. We got married in the Blue Mountains in 2019, and we're expecting our first baby this year. So we're very, very excited. Yeah, it was just, I'm over the moon about it. But so one hat that I wear at work is obviously a tax partner. I specialize in transaction taxes, mergers and acquisitions, and obviously a lot of global restructures and transactions. But so that's my day job. My day job is also the co-sponsor partner for Shine, which is our LGBTQIA plus network, or we call Sexuality and Gender Diverse Network. And when I went to one of those first events, it was very eye-opening because I walked in and it was 90% gay men, cisgendered gay men. And I was like, where are all the women? Where's the diversity within these groups? And PwC did a research paper, which I can talk a little bit more about later, around where are the women. And from there, we created Shine Women within that organization, within Shine. So in addition to Shine, the other hat I wear at work as well is I'm also one of the key partners in our diverse cultural background network called B at PwC. So CALD, or culturally and linguistically diverse, like PwC uses DCB, diverse cultural background, but effectively about raising the profile and ensuring that we have a really inclusive workplace. And we have a series of other employee networks as well. But so on the side, in addition to sort of my usual tax job, I do a bunch of things in this space, and it's just incredible being part of it. And thank you so much for inviting me. I think today's going to be a really, really good discussion. And I think personally, really resonate with sort of which what Sheetal said around intersectionality and all of the things that come with that, but also just building resilience. And I think that's a really important discussion and something that we should be talking about as well, particularly when you are part of so many different groups.
It's a pleasure to have you, Cherie. Thank you. And so, speaking of intersectionality, oh my goodness, I just tripped over my tongue. Let's get down to it. So let's start with our first question, to which I will address each of the four of you one by one. Being queer and Asian Australian, how has your culture and sexuality intersected throughout your life? Lloyd, actually, one moment. Panelists, you are more than welcome to jump in on this discussion when you want and share your experiences, as we want everyone to have their time in the limelight and for you guys to talk to each other. Lloyd, we'll start with you. As a public officer for Tricone Australia, can you tell us about the experiences you have had with your culture and coming to terms with your queer identity?
Yeah, sure. So I think, we have to put a cultural lens to this. There's the usual coming out story, which a lot of queer people face in terms of reconciling their families and themselves. But I think, at least for me personally, one of the biggest cultural parts is the concept of the individual versus community. I think at least most of us here with an Asian or South Asian background would have either had a parent or ourselves go say, well, Western cultures tend to be more individualistic. Sorry, now I'm tripping over my tongue. versus Eastern cultures being more community oriented. Like if you take the best example with countries like the US being very strong on individual liberties and things like that, whereas we tend to be a lot more community focused. Now, when you take one's sexuality and if you look at the way society talks about this, the word straight itself is used to describe anyone who's cisgender heterosexual. So that means anyone who is not part of these two labels is automatically assumed not straight, which means there are so many other words: curved, bent, queer. But ultimately, it's trying to say you're not aligning to the norm of what is expected out of heteronormative culture. So to reconcile one's sexuality to this requires a lot of individual insight, because this means sexuality and gender identity requires a lot of individual insight. That means you have to be able to separate what the culture and community expects from you versus what you truly are. And I think that is, at least from a cultural lens, that was one of the most difficult things to reconcile. And when, having been in Australia, after finding that safe space with other South Asians and Asians who are out, that gave me a significant cultural lens that, okay, this is something I can do as well. So prior to that, it was a bit of a struggle, but it's only when you see the fact that there are other people just like you who are living, who live themselves boldly out there, does it give a person confidence to actually go, all right, this is something I can actually reconcile better, and then it helps with the coming out process. So for me personally, and working, or at least first stumbling on groups like Tricone and possibly even other groups that represent various sections of their society, that really helps with being able to make this personal connection, and also reconciling it with one's cultural identity.
Thank you for sharing. Cherie, going off that, how would you say your culture and sexuality have intersected in your life?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And a little bit on Giancarlo was saying around coming out several times. I think I've had moments where growing up, like I said, I grew up in a fairly, I'll be honest, a fairly white neighborhood. There weren't many Asian kids there, and getting called, Ching Chong Chinaman, which at the time when I was 8 years old going, well, I'm not a man and I'm not from China, I was very confused and had appreciated sort of that, was experiencing racism at such a young age. And so, the cultural side for me, I think I spent a lot of my youth trying to be something I wasn't, trying to fit in. I wanted to have blonde hair and blue eyes. I didn't have either of those things. I didn't want to be dark skinned. And, so for me, I think there was an element there. And then eventually when I went to Sunnybank High, which is quite a multicultural school, and in Brisbane, it's known as there's a huge Asian community, but as well as a myriad of other groups there represented in my school. At the time I was there, it was a state high school, and we had 67 countries represented in that cohort of about 1,000 people, which was pretty impressive. But it wasn't until then that I went, actually, this is probably more reflective of the society that we should be, in. And then eventually when I kind of came to terms, I didn't come out, I guess. And I always kind of knew that I was attracted to him, but I couldn't pinpoint what that was until university. And then that was kind of when I had this more of a realization that actually, there's probably a few aspects to me that I hadn't really, really appreciated and really fully embraced. But I feel like in the last, probably in the last 6, 7, 8 years, to be honest, in the time that I've been with Kirsten, like it's been together for 7.5 years, but probably 8 years was really when I kind of came to terms with it. And I think having and coming out as part of that process to my family, that was a huge deal for, like, I was in New York at the time and I flew back to Australia, and to be honest, it wasn't well received. I didn't talk to them for a year afterwards. It was quite awful, to be honest. But since then, we've worked through it, and, there was a point where I didn't think they'd come to the wedding, and then a year later they did, right? So I guess the point of all that is the intersections, like there's so many things, you don't know what people are dealing with, and you could judge people on the face of it, but at the end of the day, they've got a whole bunch of different things that might be affecting who they are and how they might interact with you as people. And all you can really do is kind of get to know someone and share stories. I think storytelling and being authentic around that as much as you can be, and as long as you're in a safe environment, you feel comfortable to do so, is so important. And so, I think the intersection for me, like I said, mum's family was sort of, like I said, pretty Muslim, pretty Indonesian. My dad's side probably like quite Balinese in the sense of, the caste system and everything else and all the rest of it. And then I had the sexuality point overlaid with that, and it kind of gave me this massive, I think, at one point I was just really, really confused. But like I said, once I accepted all those things, and once I sort of was living my authentic self, that's when things started happening for me, right? And I appreciate I was already quite senior in my career, but doors started opening. And I think in particular in the last 5 years, I've really, really excelled because of it. And it's so bizarre because back then I sort of saw it as something that was detrimental, something that was working against me. But then when I worked out, actually, this is how it gives me strength. This is how it gives me resilience. It's actually kind of helped propel me a little bit more. So, sorry, I've said a lot of things there, probably a bit to unpack. But from an intersectionality perspective, there's quite a few bits and pieces in there that I feel quite passionate about.
Thank you so much, Cherie. And I want to ask Giancarlo, at what point did your culture and sexuality either combine or clash with each other?
Glad you came to me there, because I wanted to build upon what Cherie just talked about. This idea, Cherie just described this example where when she felt when she said to herself, she started to excel. And I think that what that really points out to people is that there's a dominant culture that we're trying to fit within. And that's what intersectionality is about, trying to recognize. Is all about trying to recognize that there is this dominant culture, which, if I can define this culture as being, ways of thinking, shared practices, shared beliefs, values, and normalize over time, right? It's that dominant culture that that our intersectional identity is. So I describe myself as non-binary, queer, disabled, etc., and we're all by nature intersectional. Everyone on this panel is intersectional. They don't fit within what Loy said, the heteronormative box, and so that's the dominant culture. And so when you think about intersectionality and the impact it has on being queer and from a culturally diverse background, that's just one layer, and that's a layer that is already quite difficult to overcome. But obviously, when you add on other layers, such as gender identity, such as disability, socioeconomic status, educational attainment, country of origin, except there's so many layers, it gets more difficult. Like, none of us here on this panel, for instance, are refugees, but a lot of refugees from I should assume that. I assume that a lot of people on this panel are refugees, but people in our communities of colour who come from refugee backgrounds have a very different experience. And so this whole, I guess, this whole thing I'm trying to say is that growing up Asian Australian as a queer person of colour who has all these intersections, it is about trying to find your space in that dominant culture. And at AGMC, we did some research recently with the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet, which is about to be released, actually. And we looked at racism and other forms of discrimination, so sexism, homophobia, all forms of discrimination. And unsurprisingly, cultural and religious settings were the most discriminatory places that we experienced as queer people of colour. But then the third was the employment setting. And I think that's, and for us, that was really, I guess, not surprising, but also somewhat surprising because, there's this, a lot of us have heard about, the marriage equality debate and having employers becoming real, stalwart, allies for marriage equality. But the reality is, from the research we did, was that was the third most discriminatory place of queer people of colour. But the surprising aspect of that setting of that research wasn't the fact that we were experiencing forms of queerphobia. It actually was the fact that we were experiencing racism, which was surprising because, to me that tells a story where, okay, we're coming out to our families and our loved ones, and that's really hard. That's a cultural and that's a cultural and religious settings. But then once we get out of that and we're in the workplace where we spend most of our time outside of our family and loved ones, it's harder. But what's harder isn't us being queer. It's actually us being perceived as less than because of our race. So to connect that to the idea I was saying earlier about that dominant culture that we're trying to fight against, navigating that is harder when race is such a prevalent issue for people who are queer. And it's one that I think impacts all of us. We see leadership opportunities not coming to people from our communities because of a whole myriad of reasons, which I won't go into now. We see lack of representation in most spheres and institutions of Australian life. So I guess I asked the question: how can growing up Asian Australians impact our cultural, us as full people when we can't see ourselves reflected back in the communities and institutions that we are part of? So I guess it's a different take I've taken, but it impacts me today because it's something that we constantly have to fight for. And while there's a story about your personal journey in coming to with culture, there's also a larger story that we're all part of as Asian Australians, where we are trying to fight. We are trying to come to terms with it in this dominant culture that we have. So, yeah, panelists, please feel free to add to that. I feel like I just said something else really blurring in my mind as the other two were talking, but I just...
Sheetal, I know you're itching to get on this. So what's your viewpoint on where your culture and sexuality intersect?
Yeah, look, everyone's talking about intersectionality, and of course it talks about a person's social and political identities and how they intersect to give us positions of privilege and give us positions that are oppressed. So it's important to note both of those. So each identity that we add on to our own comes with particular marginalizations, oppressions, and potentially privileges. So when you look at culture, so for me, my parents are from Fiji, so ancestors are from India, 5 generations in Fiji. So my parents are Fijian, Indian. I'm first generation Canadian. Then I'm here in Australia. So Indo-Fiji, Canadian, Australian. Those are all cultural ties that follow me in some way, shape, or form. And interestingly enough, I just saw in New Zealand, the segment of Fijian Indians, because we're not actually South Asians and we're not Indians. So there's this growing tension because Indians don't own us or don't accept us as Indians. And Fiji doesn't accept us as Fijians. So where do we kind of sit? So even in that cultural complexity, there's so much to unpack there. And then when you look at sexuality, so for my experience, and granted my experience is not unique, but it's not representative of everyone else's experience. But generally speaking, to my knowledge, there's no word for a lesbian in Hindi. And that's the language that my parents speak. It's a dialect of Hindi. It's more rural because our ancestors are from UP area in Fiji, or so far that we've traced back to. So the language that we speak is it's a bit of a slang. So there is no word for lesbian. There's no word for gay. So can you imagine trying to explain to someone a concept when there's no language to explain that with? So that's your first hurdle, or essentially that was my first hurdle, was how do I explain this concept to someone when I don't actually have the word? And I don't want to be graphic and try to explain to mom and dad what it actually means, because that's not going to happen in a culture that sexuality is so taboo, which ironically is the same culture that puts out the Kama Sutra. There's just so much complexity to unpack. So to ask about the intersection of culture and sexuality may seem simple. Two things intersecting: your culture, and so your racial identity and your sexual identity. How do they intersect? There's no simple answer. There's no language for me to explain it to my parents. My parents had an arranged marriage, so the concept of dating is foreign, let alone dating someone of the same gender. All of these things, complexities, and this is where the cultural component, and this is kind of why we have things like ethnic and Tricone, because there's so much to unlearn. And there's so much cultural conditioning, and it's so deeply entrenched in tradition. And for the person who's going through that coming out process, I don't have the statistics on it, but a lot of the people that I've met have come out a lot later in life. And Lloyd has talked about the community and the individual and the relationship between that. I only began my coming out journey after I was far removed from my family. Now, I don't think that's a coincidence, because when you're part of a community and it's so enmeshed that my identity is more of a daughter and a sister than it is of my individual needs and what I actually want to pursue beyond that. You have to appreciate, even though a first generation Canadian, my identity was very strongly tied to I am my father's daughter, and then I would be my husband's wife. So my identity is still tied to a man. So for me to move out on my own and pursue higher education, it was very different. And only when I was able to remove myself from that community approach and think of myself as an individual and unpack what that meant, was I able to understand, that friend that I really, 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 really liked, I think I actually was in love with or had particular feelings for. I really was able to unpack and, start to question those things. So for me, the cultural and sexuality, it's an ongoing journey. It's an ongoing unpacking, because like Sherry, it's been 5-6 years now. At first, for me to understand the process, then to take my parents along for the process. And my brother was the inspiration for me for ethnic, because there's someone who loves me, adores me, thinks I'm the coolest thing since sliced bread, but has no words to explain to mom and dad what's happening with Gigi. I don't know how to help. I don't know what you need me to tell mom and dad, because I see you're not in a position to talk to them about it, and they don't understand what they've done wrong, because of course they had to think of community. We've done something wrong as a community because they don't understand the concept. So it's for someone like him to try to be that shield and be that sword and be that advocate and be that ally. That was the whole purpose of creating something like ethnic. And that's why things like ethnic are so important, because there's so much to learn and there's so much contradiction. Like, you know, in Hinduism, we have the primordial being, Shiv Shakti, is half man, half woman. And we treat people who we know in real life who identify as hermaphrodites or identify as non-binary as less than, as untouchables, as hijras. So they're a class less than everyone else. But at the same time, we worship someone who embodies the same thing. So it's so rife with contradiction. It's so rife with so much belief and so closely tied to religion as well. And we know as soon as religion gets involved, it's such a harder conversation to unpack, because people then base their core beliefs and their identity on that. And the second you rock someone's identity, oh boy, that's asking for it. So it's a very complex space, and an hour and a half is not enough. A lifetime is not enough to unpack that. It's going to take us generations, I'm afraid, to try to unpack truly what that all looks like and to truly understand what those intersections in their own silos look like, let alone what they look like when they're enmeshed and overlapping.
Wow. On the topic of religion, I just want to throw this one. I know religion's gonna open up a big can of worms, but just a quick one, an open question to all the panelists. So going off what Sheetal just said about, you know, like you worship a deity that represents like maybe that they're both genders, and yet trans people are considered untouchables. Or Giancarlo, what you said before about in the Philippines, what it starts with B, there's a term for a third gender or something.
Yeah, bakla. Yeah.
Why does this disparity exist? Like in religion, that they can.
One word,
this.
Colonialism. No, truly. No, like, well, like at least in the Filipino experience, like the bakla were like highly revered. Like, you know, that like you had the chiefs in Filipino pre-colonial society, and they're obviously the heads of. But then the shaman were quite often the second in charge. They were the spiritual people. They were the healers. They were they were leaders in their own right, and a lot of them were trans as well. And a lot of them are women. And it wasn't until, you know, the Philippines was colonized close to 400 years by the Spanish, hence my name. And that then led to a very clear imposition of what gender meant. And if it wasn't for that imposition, the pre-colonial notions of gender would have persisted to this day, and it's forgotten. But it's at least in the Filipino experience, it's becoming a lot more recognized. And I feel a lot of colonized countries I've had similar experiences.
Yeah, I agree with GC in my albeit limited research that I've undertaken in the unpacking of why we pray to one and dismiss others. It is actually very well aligned with colonialism. So that the distinction and the binary was introduced with colonialism, because prior to that, it's all over our scriptures. It's all even in, like, again, second mention of Kama Sutra today. But you look at scriptures and you look at mandirs and you look at temples or you look at old buildings, there are actually depictions of same-sex couples performing sexual acts or being together in union or in love. So it's not a foreign concept, it's indoctrinated concept. The binary is an indoctrinated concept, and it's so deeply indoctrinated that if you go to I'm going to say most Hindu people now and try to question that, it's so deeply ingrained. It's almost offensive to question it. So you have to come from a place of compassion because it's someone's foundation. They've grown up believing it. And you can't just go in and shake someone's belief system to the core. You have to be a bit gentle with it. And I think that's a place of compassion that you come from, but not always, not everyone, and not every time can someone be in that space. If you asked me to extend that compassion while I was in the thick of things, trying to figure it out, I couldn't do that. It's only when I feel I'm in a safe space, I've come out more so towards the end of the side of the tunnel, where I can now extend that compassion and say, wow, you really just didn't understand. Like you weren't ignorant by choice. You didn't choose to be malicious. You just had no way of knowing it. Where would you have learned this? No one teaches you these things. So, I feel for those who want to take that responsibility to call that person in and say, let's have a chat or let's have a conversation. And it's taken, like I said, it'll take years. It's taken me about 5 years with my own parents to kind of get to a place of maybe not full understanding, but respect. And that's because there's such a strong foundation of love there. So for strangers and for allies who have no personal ties to the culture, the religion, or the person, or the individual, it's harder still. So I think, for people who identify and then choose to put themselves on platforms or choose to be visible, there is a bit of responsibility that comes with that, and understanding that not everyone has had access to the same information that we may have had. And, we don't know what people's backgrounds are. We don't know what information they've had access to, what experiences they've had access to. Like, Sherry said, you have no idea what a person's coming to you with. So you have to just always approach with a sense of compassion.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem what colonialism and maybe even in other places that's done is it's introduced a language, like you mentioned, it's made everything binary. Mm. And it's made that language very concrete. And language is such an important way to be able to describe these things. Even some of the language that we're using today to describe ourselves is actually very recent. And prior to that, if you didn't have the language, exploring this or even talking about it was so difficult. I'm reading this book, The Body Keeps a Score, where this person talks about how language was developed mainly to as an outwardly expression. So let's say if I want to describe Sheetal to somebody, I could do that rather easily. The language has been developed for that norm. But when you have to try and describe your internal thoughts, language has not necessarily been developed to talk about your inner narrative. And so that's why, that shows how much actually speaking language does help in being able to express sexuality, gender identity, and how far that if we have to talk about what colonialism has done, is that it's made this so binary that it's actually made the language extremely narrow.
I am being so mind blown right now. Just listening back to all of your responses on culture, it's just so eye-opening to me that everyone's been on such a different journey, and all these topics I've never even experienced or heard of. So thank you for sharing. We're going to move on to our next topic, which is representation and what it means to our queer Asian Australian panelists. So Cherie, in your professional career, as well as co-sponsor of Shine at PwC, how much representation of other queer people of color like yourself have you seen? I remember you touched on this a bit before.
This not as much as I would like, and I'll be perfectly honest. I think, and I know I'm talking from a professional services space, so lawyers and accountants and so forth that work in law firms and accounting firms. But I think there is a recognition that we've done a lot. We've done a lot from a gender, women in leadership perspective, and don't get me wrong, we still have a long way to go. But that's probably been our big focus. Certainly, PwC as a firm, and this is my opinion, I think there's now recognition that we need to go beyond that and recognizing other diverse groups, so whether it's people from diverse cultural background, part of our LGBTQIA community, those with disabilities, First Nations peoples, everything. And, it is incredibly important, but I think it is lacking. And a lot of, when you talk, we do staff surveys and things, but when you just talk to people generally, that's what people crave is, there's that old saying, you can't be what you can't see, which I'm yes and no about. Like, I think there's elements of absolutely that does assist, but at the end of the day, you can be that person that kind of lifts up and first. I think when I made partner, one of the Asian desk partner came to me and said, "Hey, can we have a coffee? And by the way, are you Indonesian?" Like, just randomly. He must have seen my name on the list. And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure." So we have coffee, and he's like, "Oh, just wanted to let you know my wife's Indonesian. I speak a little bit of Bahasa, and I recognize your last name, Mulyono. It's a very Indonesian name." I said, "Yes, absolutely." And he goes, "I actually think you're the first Australian Indonesian partner that we've had at PwC." And I said, "Well, that can't be right. Like, there's so many Indonesian people here in Sydney and Melbourne in particular." But he said, "Yeah, no, I've been at the firm for 35 years, and I don't recall ever having." So for him, that was a massive thing. And, and since then, I've helped with certain events with sort of, our Indonesian staff, and he's invited me to a few things and with Indonesian Business Council and so forth. But like, I think the point is, representation is really important. I think there is an element of, you want leadership to reflect the employee groups, but also the community as a whole. I know Giancarlo mentioned this before in terms of you want it to reflect everything else. And there are things out there, people talk about targets and measures, and there's things like the AWI, which is the Australian Workplace Equality Index through ACON or Pride and Diversity, that measures, say, LGBTI inclusion. But and certainly from a diverse cultural background perspective as well, recognizing that people of other culturally and linguistically diverse places should also be represented, because that's more reflective of the community. So, look, in a nutshell, to answer your question, there's not enough. I think there's, to be honest, I think I'm certainly the only person of colour who identifies as a female and lesbian or bisexual, but I think there are certainly some cisgendered gay men who are Asian, who are obviously in leadership positions. But there is a big gap there. And so, if anything that you take away from this is just like, get out there and be the best person you possibly can be, because we're craving it, we want it. There's recognition that we need it, about making sure that who identify in any of those areas are actually supported and feel like they're in a safe enough environment to kind of be themselves and progress, right?
Absolutely. And thank you for being that shining example. Like, I feel like you're trailblazing in your area for others like you.
Thank you. I feel like amongst us panelists, definitely not a trailblazer. So I feel like.
So, Giancarlo, as president of the Australian LGBTQ Multicultural Council, also known as AGMC, you have mentioned the topic of cultural leadership prior to this. What does that mean to you?
Well, there are, I guess, two senses of the word that it means. Like, Sherry just mentioned it earlier, like having leaders from in organisations coming from diverse cultural backgrounds. That's a really, 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 really interesting area. But I think the other way of looking at cultural leadership is leaning into your. And this is my definition. It's built on other things, but it's for me, it's around leaning into your cultural, I guess, what how do I put this? Leading into cultural, your cultural, not expectations. Sorry, cultural. Your culture, that's probably a better way of putting it, your culture in to lead in ways that aren't prevalent. So, for instance, when you think of leadership styles, the extroverted, assertive, opinionated person who leads from the front is often seen as the model or the type of leadership style that's valued in organisations. But then there are different types of leadership styles that can be culturally informed. For me personally, leading from behind is one that's very much culturally informed for me, where I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty. I want to recognize that that everyone makes mistakes and create a culture where people feel like they can share those mistakes, so we can then come together to overcome that issue or that barrier. That's a different style of leading, and so for me, cultural leadership has that meaning as well. It's about leaning into your cultural upbringing and recognizing that there are different types of leading that you can hone in based on our culture.
Amazing. And Sheetal, as president as well of Ethnic and the million other hats that you wear, you facilitate the stories of ethnic LGBT plus communities into societal action. Can you tell us about how representation influences Ethnic's operation as well as your own? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, that's a classic faux pas, post-pandemic Zoom issues. Look, I think visibility is important. With Ethnic, storytelling is the center of a lot of what we do, because stories give you an opportunity to identify with someone. And when you identify with someone, you can understand them a bit better, have compassion with them, and then you don't feel like an outsider. You don't feel othered anymore. So storytelling is quite important for that visibility piece, so that people, like we said, someone had mentioned on the panel earlier, that then I found out that there are other people who experience this. And I think Lloyd had mentioned this feeling of inclusion and belonging, because someone else has had this experience too. So that's the importance of visibility within the ethnic space, within the Ethnic Plus organization space, and within the queer people of color space. I think that kind of visibility is good. But I say that with a few caveats. Representation, it's important to acknowledge that one person's story is not the same or representative of an entire community, because as we've already established, each individual has intersecting identities. So my story is not going to be representative of every Fijian, Indian, Canadian, Australian person, as many of them as there may be. It's not going to be the same. You can identify and you can connect with me on that point, and we'll have a lot more in common, and we can have chats, and we can speak our half Hindi, half English language, and that's great. But it would be a disservice for me to put my story out to say this is now reflective of every gay, Indian, Fijian, whatever other labels society wants to put on me. On that same token, we have to be mindful that sometimes society will assume that anyway. So a takeaway for the allies in this space is, just because you've talked to one gay person doesn't mean you've talked to the entire community. Just because you've talked to one cultural person doesn't mean you've talked to every single culture. Just because you talk to one brown person doesn't mean you know every brown person's experience. And for some of you that are here, that may seem really absurd, but there are plenty of people who adopt that mentality. On the topic of visibility and representation is, if I could be somewhat controversial, I think representation is useless unless it's inclusive. So if you put someone in a position and you don't listen to them, no point in having them in that position. It's actually a disservice to bring someone to that space and not listen to them. It's more insulting. The outside people might think that, you've created a space for them, that they've got a seat at the table. But if you're not listening to them, there's no point. It's equally problematic to then try to suggest, we keep hearing about this business case for diversity and inclusion. Can we appreciate how insulting that is? Because you're asking someone to explain to you why my voice is valid because it's different than yours. So this putting forward a business case for diversity and inclusion is essentially saying to someone, tell me why I should listen to your experience that's different. And we do it anyway. The diverse communities, the diversity dimensions do it anyway to say, we bring value to your company. You can engage with your clients that identify like I do, or want to work with other people that look like me, or that talk like me, or that sound like me, or whatever the case may be. And that's problematic. So representation, I think, is good in particular situations. When you're talking within the Cal LGBT community, it's great because there's storytelling and you can identify and you can feel like you belong. When you're talking about more corporate Australia in professional services sector, and I say that from a background of being a lawyer, the profession is not inclusive. We talk about diversity and inclusion. Every organization has a diversity and inclusion plan, but it's not inclusive. Profession is made up of so many diversity dimensions, and how many of them do you see sitting at top tier firms in management positions as partners running the firm? I used to work at the peak body, and it's run by a council of older white men and some females. Where's the diversity? There hasn't been a single person of color on that council in the history of that council, and it's been running since the 1800s. So you tell me where representation is, but I can guarantee you'll see a colored person in every advertisement for every firm, or every poster, or every banner. So there's representation, but there's not inclusion. So representation for me is not enough. It's a starting point. And in some communities it's great, but it's plagued with so many other issues. And the unfortunate thing is people think, oh, representation, great, we've done our part. No, you've just started.
I completely agree with that. And when I think of representation, I think it is about a myriad of things. I think that it is about, yes, inclusive behaviors. And I think that in order to have inclusive, so you could promote anyone, right, to a leadership position, but if you don't provide the support, you're effectively setting them up to fail, because you're setting them up, you're putting up, then go, well, we've got representation here on the board, or in the partnership, or whatever it might be. But if you don't actually provide the parameters and all of the surrounding things, because at the end of the day, like colonialism, everything that is set up currently today in society is built on a colonial system. Totally. And that's the problem, right? And so in order to break down those barriers, you do need, I think it needs to be a whole bunch of things. But I think that representation is important, but I think so is visibility, so is inclusive behaviors, and even inclusive behaviors themselves, right? So companies or firms that might put pedal, like you said, on the glossy pamphlet, and everyone does it, universities, you name it, right? But you need to have the policies as well to create that inclusive culture. So I think that there's a whole bunch of things. And so, for example, something that I'm really proud of that we have is like a gender affirming plan, right? So we give people 15 days leave if they want to transition. We give them a wardrobe allowance. We basically give a whole series of support. We've even run what we call an LGBTQI inclusive workplace training for their team, so that they can effectively ask questions and learn about gender diversity, right? So it's about having all these little things like networks, all the great work that all of you do in society, and about to educate other people, but also then you still need leaders and people like yourselves leading all of these things. And I think the problem that we've had, and you've seen it as well, like in terms of trying to address gender diversity, they go, well, we've got all these women, look at ScoMo. He just did that the other day. It was like, all right, I'm changing my cabinet. We're going to put all these women in charge of these key accounts, right? But do they have the support behind them? Are they actually being set up in a way that is actually conducive to be able to do their jobs? Are they actually, worthy of those roles? Is it just kind of tokenism? I completely agree. And I do know what you're saying around the word representation is probably, not sufficiently apt, or perhaps there's other words that also need to be read into that, which is how I've interpreted it. But I completely agree. I don't think you can.
Yes. Don't get me wrong. I think representation is great. I just don't think it's a half measure. It's a good start, but it is just a start. And to your point, when it is about representation, then people start thinking about quotas. And it's like, oh, you got that job because you're the diversity dimension. And it's not because you're qualified, it's because they needed a brown person, or they needed a woman, or they need someone from the rainbow community. It's like, come on, how dismissive is that?
Totally,
it
but
perpetuates this idea of quotas, which is problematic.
No,
sorry. Oh no, go on.
I was just going to add, I completely agree. When I was going for partnership, one thing I was very cognizant of, and I didn't want to be the poster child for diversity. Like, I was very much like, if you read my business case, it was like numbers. This is the revenue I brought. These are the clients I worked with. This is blah, 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 blah. And at the very end, I had a couple of lines about, shine and a few other things that I was doing, because I was so focused on, I don't want to be known as this person. And then when I actually made it, everyone went, that's not the reason why you got here, right? Like, the reason why you got here was because of all the great things that you've done on your business case, and you've established all these things. And now you have a platform to be able to do other things as well. And that's kind of the way I've seen it. And I completely agree though, because I felt like I had to over-credentialize myself to justify why I was there.
Yeah.
And it was very clear when I did my interviews, they said, like, you've done all this incredible stuff, like, in New York and whatever, but it's almost like you have to prove why you're here, whereas everyone kind of accepted while they were here. And that was a really big turning point for me, where I went, you know what, now I have that platform, I need to be able to pass it on. And I can see it very clearly in all of you as well. So yeah, I just wanted to share that tidbit.
I just want to say, sorry, GC, go.
I was just going to weigh into this debate, because it's a really interesting debate. And I think, I guess the thing I want to add to that was just like, everything needs to be a multi-pronged approach. Like, I like using I've talked about this with quite a few large organizations. And I remember the first thing the way I like to conceptualize is like, look, we all we all know what foods we shouldn't eat. But because if you want to lose weight, right? And we all know what we need to do to lose weight, but then that knowledge in itself isn't enough for us to have a healthy relationship with food and exercise. And so and so I use that analogy to demonstrate, like, just awareness of it and acting on a superficial level or in a tokenistic way, as Sheetal has outlined, isn't really helpful. But at the end of the day, the literature on say unconscious bias, for instance, shows that that no matter how much you are aware of your biases, it doesn't matter cultural change until you actually take that multi-pronged approach. And so I think every aspect of Sheetal's points around tokenistic approaches to inclusion and representation and diversity and all that stuff all plays a bigger role. And I think what organizations don't do well is finding that right balance. Like Khalil in the comments just talked about, focusing on one group leads to envy and marginalization of others. Like, we have to remember, like, this conversation that as I said earlier, is about finding a dominant culture. And so when we recognize that inclusive means to be able to bring up everyone, because it means that everyone, no matter your gender, your sexuality, your country of origin, whatever that may be, you have equal opportunity to participate and to excel. And that in itself, it requires a multi-pronged approach, and it's a hard balance. I think no one's done that well in large employers, but it also means that we kind of need to take that responsibility on ourselves, because I think it kind of goes back to the point that Sherry was just making about, once you accept it, once you start being the moral minority, you can actually start leading. It goes back to the definition I was saying about cultural leadership. We can lead into ways in which we can excel for our communities, so we can actually represent the communities in a way that's meaningful to us.
Thank you, guys. I just want to say on behalf of the AAP team, this is incredibly powerful stuff, and I am just shook. Moving on, Lloyd, I know you want to touch on this topic. What has your experience with tokenization been like?
So I think, a lot of this has already, especially I picked up parts of what Sherry has been talking about. It's like, if you're being tokenized, sometimes you question where you are, because have you gotten there because of a token, or whether it's because you're there through your own merit, of course. And Yeah, so that does play a part over there. Actually, I wanted to shift gear a little bit because Sheetal's story about, or was it Sherry who mentioned just representation and being a poster boy, or finding a relevant poster to thing is just the beginning. That's actually so correct, because there is a particular incident, this was way back in 2017, where I think there's an organization called ACON. This is for the benefit of our allies who might not know what ACON is. It's the AIDS Council of New South Wales. They are a government-funded organization that's one of the premier institutions for sexual health and counseling services, and many things to the New South Wales queer community. What they found back in 2017 was that although particularly HIV rates were going down in New South Wales, what they found was that it was not, the messaging was not necessarily going through with what they call Asian Australians who were not born in Australia. And when they did some research, they actually found that a lot of the community was not finding themselves being represented, especially with the messaging that was coming out through ACON with regards to sexual health. It tended to have a lot of cisgender white male homosexuals depicted on their posters, and they felt the need to start a whole project called an Asian Gay Men's Project, which apparently was a big impact to try to get more normal looking South Asian people, namely myself, on some of those posters and information booklets. And that has been such a powerful impact, because now you would have Asians and South Asians feeling a bit more inclusive just by seeing seeing more of our kind, in these posters. That was back in 2017. And like you said, Sheetal, that representation is just the beginning. I don't see how that would work in 2021. I think to have an Asian Gay Men's Project itself seems like a very tokenistic way of approaching it. I think everything that was tried to be achieved with that program should be integrated into the main program itself at large, which means it should be normal thinking to have Asians as well represented on such posters, rather than it being like an afterthought or a special project to get this extra need for it back then. So it worked in 2017 to a certain extent, but we're in 2021. I think things have moved on to a great extent. Back in 2017, it felt like, yes, it did feel like you're being tokenized, because you have to have a separate project and also have literally poster boys for that. And it just feels a bit out of place in 2021. It worked then, but it just doesn't, it would be a little bit tone deaf in today's space.
Thanks for speaking on that, Lloyd. I just want to thank you for the shout out to Socializations, which is the Gay Asians men's group within ACON. I'm a part of them. And I just want to comment that I think that we have this little society is because, like, we'd love to be integrated into the rest of ACON and put on those, posters like everyone else, but they're just not letting us. And so, like, I've done those photo shoots for Socializations before, the Gay Asians Men Project, and just hearing that, I'm just like, yeah, why aren't we part of the
mainstream projects?
Yeah, the fuller picture. And so while we are very successful and we We have a lot of, look, if you're in Sydney, we have a board games night at Acon. Actually, is it being held somewhere else now? I'll get back to you on that. But it's very successful, and it's a great community. And I think it was formed out of necessity because I think Australia still has a bit of ways to go to accepting the multiculturalism that they have. So we are running a tiny bit over time, but everyone's okay to stay on. I promise you, all of you, this is not going to go past 9:20 at most. So we're going to get to our last juicy part. I want to hear from each of the panelists what their experience with relationships as a queer person of color has been like, with family, friends, or dating, and intricacies that come with. So Sheetal, we discussed before, smiling ear from ear. We discussed before your journey with your family has been tumultuous, to say the least. Can you shed some light on your relationship with them?
Yeah, look, it started off not too great. So I lived in Australia. I came out after I had my first relationship, and I was grieving a relationship in secret. And my mom, because she's an amazing mom, knew something was wrong. And I told her that, the person who she thought was my best friend was actually my girlfriend. And long story short, she booked a flight the next day to come to Australia and booked 2 tickets for me to come back home. And I was in such disarray, grieving the secret relationship, no support network because I hadn't told anyone. And the people that I had told here had no capacity to be my support because they were 2 other students in law school. So I had to go back home. I needed my support system, and they were my support system at that time. And they still are. So I kind of thought I'd put that part of me away, and navigated that with my parents. And my mom didn't tell my dad at the time, said, if it's over, we don't have to worry him about it. It's fine. Just like under the rug. And then one day at dinner, Dad brought up, so what is this I heard about you and so-and-so? And I was like, oh God, okay. That was 2014. Then it happened again. I found someone else to get into a relationship with, and my mom had said, just be honest with me. And I told her what had happened. And look, it's the longest story, as the storyteller in me will take ages to tell all the intricacies. But it went from stages of where it was discussed, if that's what you're going to do with your life, then we prefer for you to stay in Australia and do that, and we'll stay here. And then that progressed to, we love you so much, we don't care what you do, come back home. Then that progressed to, okay, just don't put it on social media. At the end of the day, it was just unpacking what was the core worries for them and understanding where that was coming from. So for them, it's about, I'm going to hear an echo of people. What will other people think? What will the community think? What are other people going to have to say? What are the aunties and uncles going to say about this? And as I grew older, and as my parents grew older, they started to care less and less about what other people think. And everything else about me started to scream so much louder than my sexuality that it became, I'm not going to say a non-issue, but it became something not front and center anymore. They focused more on the fact that I was, I had my own law firm, I had this. There's so many other things for people to focus on than that. So with my parents, it's been a journey. And I'm sure if you ask my parents now, they'd have, they'd feel a bit bad about the way that they reacted. But again, they reacted with the knowledge they had at hand. They didn't understand what it all meant. Sometimes I feel like they still don't understand. But now my mom is actually doing anti-racism and LGBTI training at work. So you think of like how quickly, and that's incredibly fast. And I attribute that to the amount of work that my parents have been doing on their own behind my back that they've undertaken because they want to maintain a relationship with me, that my brother's been doing on my behalf, that I've been working on. The distance is quite good in that respect. It makes it a lot easier for me to live comfortably, not having to worry about living under Dad's roof or very close to my family or embarrassing them or whatever the case may be. So all of those things, and I'm going to backpack off of that and talk about, if I may, about dating and relationships. And what I say that, and I know that and I feel this need to defend it right away, because a lot of people judge, and a lot of people from non-CALD backgrounds judge. And they say, well, why aren't your parents on board? Like I said, there's so much to unpack and so much to unlearn. My parents would have no idea they never met a gay person in their life prior to their daughter. So it's very, awakening for them. And it's very hard. Like dating initially was, things like Tinder and apps and things are very deceiving, because I thought it would be funny to tell people I had an accent. I do. I have a quote unquote Canadian accent, but a lot of people thought I had an Indian accent, and that's somehow unattractive. So the second that I had said that to a person that I was speaking with at that time, she had immediately said, oh God, no, not interested in meeting you anymore. And I was like, right, because I have an accent, not understanding that it was a Canadian accent or an Indian accent, but she thought it was an Indian accent, which she then later told me, because I met her ages and I called her out on it. And I said, hey, that was a bit shady. So we came to that understanding of that. So there's that kind of racism that happens, and GC's already spoken to that point. A similar Caucasian person, because apparently that's what I seem to be drawn to, had raised, well, why don't your parents understand? I don't understand how your parents could not be inclusive. You shouldn't have a relationship with them. You should just cut them off, leave them. I'm like, you can't say that. We are a culture that's so entrenched in community. That's my family. I'll choose them 100 times over, even if they've done wrong by me, because that's what I'm ingrained to do. So I can't cut off my family, and I can't choose you or over, the family that I've had. So relationships can be very tricky to navigate. And I'm very lucky that towards my last few relationships, and the relationship I'm currently in is with someone who's so compassionate and understanding to cultural nuances, and has an invested interest in learning how to be a better ally to the CALD community, and is actually taking an active, proactive approach to finding out what mom likes or dad likes, and bartering conversations on that. So I think it's, again, one of those things you can't talk about sexuality and relationships and family without unpacking all the intersectional things that come with it, because there's cultural nuances. It's not just a gay thing, it's about a gay cultural thing. And again, explaining what that looks like, and this idea of what a big Indian wedding looks like. God, it's a huge monumental thing. And I've robbed that from them. And I use that language specifically because that's what it feels like for them. And only when I come out of that space where I stop thinking of myself and try to put myself in my parents' shoes and think of what they're going through, they had big dreams and ideals for their one eldest daughter that was going to have this big Indian wedding. And now that's potentially gone, or it's not going to look like the way that they thought it would. So it's a lot of compassion that you have to approach with, and conversation, and uncomfortable conversations, and heavy conversations. And it takes time to unpack that. And those are the same kind of conversations I've had with potential partners or partners that, look, I may or may not get married. For my own personal journey, I came from a space of my first partner. I said, I never want to have a child with a woman. I only want to have a child with men, because that's in my head the only way it's supposed to be done. Because that's the conditioning I had at the time. As I unlearned and as I became more comfortable with myself, now I've gotten to the place where in between, it was like, oh, I'm just going to have a roommate, never going to have a wife, because I can have a roommate, I just can't have a female wife. Now it's come to the place where, and my friends can attest to this, every year, every 6 months, I'll check in and be like, oh yeah, I'm pretty happy to get married and have a wife. I could do that. Oh yeah, I think I'd be the one that would carry the child. When a year ago, it'd be like, I thought you only wanted a child with a man. What's happened? So it's such a
It's pretty great, by the way.
Space. Pardon?
It's pretty great, by the way, having a wife.
I don't doubt it. And I see, my friends, a gay couple, and they have a child, and I see it. And the more it becomes normalized because of that representation, because of that inclusion, because of those conversations, it makes it easier. And I introduce those friends then to my family, who then see, oh, this is not bad. This is not as foreign as I thought it was. This is actually, they're still good people. And it seems like a really absurd approach, but when you don't know about something, there's this innate fear of it. So when mom meets Kate and Wendy and their little bub, and they say, oh yeah, I remember Kate, I remember Wendy. Oh yeah, that's great. That's a cool family. That's, good. So if I were to go have that, they understand what that would look like. So that fear is gone. So when it comes to relationships, I think the visibility is really important, but it's a lot of communication. It's a lot of heavy chats.
Definitely, without a doubt, it's a long journey of unlearning. Seeing as often our parents are a product of their time and culture, which is we just fly in the face of that, you know. So Lloyd, I remember earlier you mentioned your culture struggling with the perceived individualism that comes with your sexuality. How has that affected your relationships in dating and your community?
With dating, you're going to have to ring fence me on this because this is a topic that can go on for quite a while. But anyway, I'll try and ring fence myself on this. Look, this was definitely the most tricky and most complicated part to navigate. I mean, there's one thing about the topics that Sheetal had already covered, which is coming out to your family is one thing, and also repeatedly coming out. I mean, you don't come out once like how TV shows would like to show it, but you're doing this almost every few months, every few weeks, and in fact, the later in your life that you come out, the more of those other people's images of you that you have to literally pull apart and then rebuild with. Say, no, that's not what you were thinking. This is how the new norm is going to be. I think culturally, when I was new to the country, there was a lot of things I didn't understand. I'm going to touch upon the topic of fetishization. I think a lot of people have probably experienced this. At first, when you're quite naive, you don't know what you're experiencing. But you just like the attention that you're getting. So, and if you get into this rather blind, what you realize is, as a consequence of this, people don't necessarily see you as an individual. They see you as a person, as a token of the community. There's barely any interest to get to know you. There's also a case of you're Indian, Asian, whatever country you may be from. So therefore, there's a certain expectation or a certain amount of behaviors that I'm expecting from you, but you're not necessarily delivering on that front. So that is one of the initial things that you have to navigate to get out of. And of course, once you see it, you see it quite often. The other areas, and especially if you're talking about dating somebody who's not from this similar background from you, and is how do people view your own cultural background? And I think sometimes having an idea of how your culture could be perceived, both positively and negatively, could help you navigate this in a better way. The last time I'd actually gone for a haircut nearby, this person is actually a Chinese immigrant. He's been living here he probably moved here when he was quite young, and his assistant as well is, as I found out, is a Chinese immigrant. And I go there and they do great service. They pull up chats and things like that. I had gone there after about 6 weeks, and the attendant, his assistant, attended to me. And one of the first questions she actually asked is, "How's your family doing back in India?" And I thought that was a really nice thing to ask. And gradually, that discussion went on to how individual countries have been responding to the pandemic. And she was telling about her family in China, how much more responsive the people have been to what the government has been doing to curb the pandemic. And she openly compared it to the way other countries, other democracies have been handling this, and she says, she was talking rather openly, saying democracy is quite a sham, and there's no true country out there that's democratic. And there was one question I wanted to ask her, but I just couldn't, which is, although there's been a lot of positive input that you've been talking about, and everything that she spoke was definitely true, and the way people responded to their government and things, but how much of bad news have you been able to tell me in this time? It comes across as, how do people, I mean, if China is able to do the same things that the United States is doing and is getting a slap on the wrist for it, why do people trust the United States more versus China? They're practically almost doing the same thing in terms of the government. And I wanted to ask her this question: how does she think this gets perceived in the Australian community at large? And that's why what I'm trying to practically put into a nutshell is how much of a community is perceived culturally, both with its positivity, with everything that we have to offer in positively and also negatively, plays a big impact in how sometimes when we try to get to know somebody, especially at an intimate level, with somebody who's outside of our cultural spectrums, those are the complexities that definitely get in the way.
Thank you for sharing. Just being considerate of time, we'll just quickly run through the next few ones. Cherie, can you tell us about how your relationships have been affected by being queer? Even though I know you're happily partnered and I am immensely jealous. Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. I probably said a little bit already, but I dated mostly men throughout university. I had one girlfriend that I kept on the down low, so my university friends knew that I was perhaps not straight, but I didn't really come to terms with it, I think, properly until Kirsten, until I met my wife, and I went, oh, this is different. I think for my parents, it was same thing as Sheetal was saying around, like, that they have hundreds of years of cultural, religious and cultural upbringing that was really difficult to navigate for them, because, and someone else said it on the call too, it's really, they're shaking their being and everything they've ever known, right? And, I shared this story actually with Shine Women internationally, and one of the common themes that came out was a lot of women we were overseas and then suddenly went, you know what, we've met someone, we're going to come out. And I did come out to my parents while I was overseas. I mean, I did it in person, and then it was quite awful, actually. They blamed themselves. They couldn't rationalize it, couldn't understand it. And I went back, and just was like, well, okay, well, I'm in New York, I'm thousands of kilometers away. I'm just going to focus my life and do this. And I think from that, it drove me to be better, because I felt like I needed to prove something to them, almost, that, hey, I'm the same person, but I'm better than what you thought I was, right? And I can do all these great things, despite what you see as a handicap for me, which is I'm bisexual and I date women. And it was a real, apologies, that was probably not the right term, but genuinely, like, it was a very, really, really hard discussion, and we didn't talk for a really long time. And it was really hard to navigate. My little brother, who's 6 years younger than me, he's 6 years younger than me, and he was so incredibly, you and talk about allyship, and I know we've touched on it a little bit, but that's so important. He actually helped with just tempering my parents a little bit and kind of saying, look, talk to me. I want to understand where you're coming from, but Shree's going through this. And he would call me all the time and check in on me. And so I'm really grateful because I had an ally at home. And I think that was really important for me. And since then, they've really kind of come, like I said, they've come a really long way in what I think is a relatively short period of time for, like Indonesian Asian parents that, even though they've lived in Australia for a very long time, probably longer now than since they've lived in Indonesia. they've sort of come around to it. And then even when we told them we were having a little baby, like I actually held off for a long time because I'm like, I don't know how they're going to react to this. Like, are they going to think this is only a man and a woman can have a baby? And what are we doing? Are we going to, where's the masculine energy? Where's like the father figure? Like, I was really concerned about all these things. But when I eventually did it, it's like they'd almost educated themselves to some degree and they've gone, we're really excited. This is our first grandchild. And that's the exact reaction you want, right? And it took a little bit for me to go, hey, actually, they've grown too. This is amazing. And now, we have some pretty good conversations and they're coming to visit next weekend, and they've come such a long way. So I totally understand where you're coming from when you said that, Sheetal, around, you can't just cut them out. I mean, there's extended family probably in Indonesia that don't know. And I'm fully aware of that. And but all I can do now is I kind of harness that energy and use it into my career and do other things, because I can't really worry about that anymore. I've kind of accepted that, like, I'm happy to take them on the journey, but if it's not going to get productive, I kind of can't do much more. And I just need to kind of take a step back. I will share one story. Before I met Kirsten, I was in a relationship with a guy, and in hindsight, we were not a match, and that's fine. But he'd gotten a job overseas in Hong Kong, didn't tell me about it. We broke up, whatever. And then I went over there and he's like, actually, maybe we should go back together. And, we've talked a little about racism, coming from, a white person's perspective or a culture beyond sort of Asian, Southeast Asian. But like when I was in Hong Kong, I experienced racism, which was so interesting for me. And then I had this realization, I went to visit him and people were just treating me a bit differently. And then I realized that a lot of the maids and cleaners are Filipino or Indonesian. And I was treated differently because I was, and I distinctly remember I went into a shop. It was quite a fancy shop. And I went to I had my bag on me and the lady said, oh, ma'am, you've got to put your bag in these lockers. No one's allowed to walk around the shop with their bags, whatever. And I was looking around and everyone was holding their handbags. So it wasn't a thing. And I was like, oh, okay. And then my boyfriend came in at the time and they were like, oh, so welcome. How can we help you? And I was like, whoa, like what the hell? So even within, you just don't know where it's going to come from, really, is my point, right? And I know we've said a little bit about Caucasian culture or Western culture and how the differences are in colonialism, but it can kind of happen anyway. It can catch you off guard anywhere. And so I think, anyway, sorry, back to the point is I think for my parents, knowing that I'd had a lot of serious boyfriends in the past, they were very shocked. And that was another thing that they kind of had to deal with. But, like I said, all so far so good now. And things are really, really on the up and up. And I'm just really happy. And I appreciate some people on this call, you might identify as being part of this community, but you're not out yet to your family and whatever. And then there's no right or wrong answer here, right? Like it's whatever works for you, whatever timing works for you, because at the end of the day, it's your individual story and that's all that matters. But if you are choosing to do that, and just know that find those support people around you, allies and friends and other family members that might be supportive to help you, because for me, it was very liberating and I'm glad I did it. Because since I've lived my truth and authentically, I feel like I'm and correct. Yeah, absolutely. It's different for everybody. So, but for me personally, I needed to do it and I'm kind of glad I did.
Thank you, Shuri. And just quickly, Giancarlo, you have stated multiple times that you've had to come out, that in the past you had to come out multiple times in many different ways with your sexuality, gender identity, and disability. Just briefly, how has that affected your relationships?
Yeah, I will be brief because I'm really conscious of the time for everyone. So let me just introduce two things. Obviously, like a lot of my experiences are reflective of what the others have said so far. But I think the first thing I wanted to say is to show my story is introduce two concepts. The first is the idea of code switching. So for those who don't, so as a result of that intersectional background and history that I have, I've become very adept at switching between different cultures. And so that experience is known as code switching, where you can where you can switch between different cultures quite easily, so you can feel safe and belong in that culture. And I think that's a really important thing to be aware of. And the second thing, just again in the interest of time, is just this idea of, I want to share my definition of resilience. Because I think a lot of the times when we're talking about these interpersonal relationships, it's really hard to navigate, right? And so the reason why I want to share my definition is it kind of helps navigate that. And my definition goes something along the lines of this, where when you think of resilience, it's really about trying to equip yourself with the tools and understanding to articulate your experiences, so you can prepare yourself to challenge others about your experiences. And this act of understanding how to articulate and share your experience with others allows you to have opportunities to bring our communities along with us, so we can affect the change we want to see. And so that's the two things I just wanted to share, because I'm really conscious of the fact that it's 9:20. But hopefully with those two things, with those two concepts and those two things, navigating what is really complex relationships can be made easier.
Thank you so much. And so that brings us to the end of our questions. Just going to move on to, let's see if I can change the screen share to the questions. All right. Can everyone see my questions? All right, let's see. Okay. So I'm going to choose, unfortunately, because of time, I can only choose 2 questions from here. But panelists, there are also questions in the Zoom chat, and you are welcome to reply directly to those as well, just so we can try to get more answers in. Okay, I want to pose that second question. It's an open question to all the panelists. What if you don't feel really relatable to the LGBTQ plus community? What do you do?
Interestingly, all seem to have a mute response to this.
Yeah, it's.
Go ahead, GC.
What if you don't feel relatable? I guess there's a lot in that question. Like, what underlies that question is what's got me more interested in, as opposed to trying to think of an answer. But I think if I can kind of guess what the person's asking, it's the fact that they don't see themselves in their community. And I think the thing I would say to that is that's okay, and you've got to recognise that that you can find multiple sources of support across different communities. And it also a call to action. Really, I would say that if you that you should always find yourself trying to connect with people who share some aspects of who you are, so you can try and build that community yourself. And that to me is a really powerful force. I know just the other day I was talking to Sherry about Southeast Asians represented who are queer. Like, because when you think of queer, I think of Asians in Australia, it's said to East Asian, South Asian. And it's like, well, it's so nice to talk to someone from Southeast Asia. And so I would encourage that person to think about how you can connect with people where you can on things you can relate on.
Yeah, to that point, if you don't feel relatable in the LGBT community, I think that's okay. Just like GC said, when I was coming out, it was only 2-3 years ago in a professional capacity. I went to an event run by 3 big organizations, and I was the only brown person in the room. And I remember asking someone else, saying, "Where are the brown people?" And you keep hearing, you can't be what you can't see. And this lady, become a friend of mine, said, maybe that means you have to be it. Maybe you have to be the one that people can see. And there's 2 tokens to that. One, you have to be in a safe enough space to do that. and I was. So don't take that to mean, okay, come out and be the representation, because people are not going to look to you if you don't feel like you're in a safe space. I was in a very safe and privileged space where I had my family's back and support. And at the end of the day, that's the only support that I care for, an opinion that I care for. So I felt like I could be in that space. And look at what's happened in the course of, it's literally been just 2 years. So in 2 years' time, I went from someone who knew no one in the community, felt not relatable to anyone in the community. And when I put myself out there and said, this is who I am, this is what I want to try to do, I came across Mikara, who was trying to do the same thing. And then other people who have been trying to do the same thing. And Ethnic has since grown to 100+ members because we're all trying to do the same thing. And we all didn't feel like we related. We've then found Dracone, we found SheQ, other organizations. So I think what you'll find is, however you feel comfortable doing it, the more you engage with the community, you will find people to relate to in some way, shape, or form. And you'll find that sense of belonging, because I feel like at the end of the day, that's maybe what you're kind of going for. And you'll find that sense of belonging in the LGBT community just by exploring it a bit more. And there's nothing wrong with, even if beyond that you don't feel it within the LGBT community. This is why Outlook's different for everyone. And this is something that people who take a visible role need to advocate for, that Outlook's different for everyone. Not everyone can be out waving a pride flag and all, whatever the case may be, and respecting that, because otherwise the result is people like you who then feel that you can't relate because Outlook's a particular way when it doesn't, it shouldn't.
Absolutely, Sheetal. I also want to pose another question. So the fourth one down, who are some queer and called individuals you look up to or have been inspired by in both your professional and personal lives? If any, hopefully.
Audre Lorde, look her up. If you haven't heard of her, go read about Audre Lorde, about people of color, LGBT, and just the mother of all things amazing. If you want to learn more about intersectionality, look to Kimberly Crenshaw. Lots of different people. I mean,
you coined the term, right? Really?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
On a last note, I just want each of you to sound off really quickly. Keep it brief, because tonight we've talked about a lot of challenges of being queer and Asian Australian. What are some things that we should celebrate about being queer and Asian Australian?
Everything.
Intersectionality. Celebrate intersectionality.
Yeah, there's so much that we contribute that gets either misrepresented or underrepresented, I should say. So those are some amazing things we could celebrate.
Totally agree with all of that. All of it, everything that like ethnicity, culture, like language brings to Australia as a community as a whole. We add a richness to it and a color to it, which is, Australia wouldn't be Australia without any of that. And on top of that, being part of the LGBTI community as well. Like it's really exciting time. Sydney World Pride is going to be here in 2023, and it's going to be all about the Asia Pac region and First Nations people. So get on board, come along to that. Like it's amazing. Yep. Get in there.
Thank you. And so that brings us to the end of our LGBTQIA plus Fireside Chat. We're incredibly grateful to our panelists for their time tonight, and please join me in giving them an round of applause, even though you're all on mute, it's okay. And also a big thanks to the AAP team for helping make this possible. Thank you for attending and staying as long as you did. And do connect with us on our socials, because we'll be creating more events like this in the future. We hope you enjoyed yourselves and, most importantly, learned something meaningful about being Asian Australian. Humphrey, would you like to wrap up for us?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Humphrey. I'm the president of AAP, and I'll keep this really, really brief. Just wanted to touch on two things. So firstly, to anyone in the audience, if you're comfortable sharing your video, feel free to do so we can all see some faces, and we might actually take a quick screenshot of that as our version of event photography, basically. But secondly, and most importantly, some big thank yous in order. So just like to reiterate that thank you to our four panelists for sharing some really personal experiences and just giving us, so many things to reflect on and learn about. Secondly, a big thank you to Eric for his wonderful work emceeing our panel tonight, as well as the AP team who worked behind the scenes to make this possible. And finally, a big thank you to our audience or anyone watching in the future, if you happen to be. We're really passionate about, sharing these diverse and unique stories. And this is our third Fireside Chat to date, and it's our biggest one to date. So we're really grateful to everyone who came. So we all hope you got something out of it. Be sure to connect with us. We'll also share the panelists' socials afterwards as well. We've got a lot more panels coming up and, social events, mentoring programs, talks. So stay in touch with us if you'd like. Otherwise, I think that wraps it up for tonight. Hope everyone gets some good sleep.
Beautiful. And actually, someone just entered the waiting room, if we could admit them. I want the panelists to answer one more question, if they could be also taken off mute. One sentence only. If for any allies that are in this call, I really wanted to address them. What are some ways that that allies can be, or better allies to us? One sentence.
I'll give you one word. Just educate yourself.
It's 21h30.
Yeah, language, I think being inclusive of language, I think is a big deal to the community.
I think storytelling and sharing stories both ways, because I'm sure that there'll be some really interesting things that you'd like to share, and certainly from anyone in the community, whether you're Asian or LGBTI or identify as all of those things, share those stories.
Thank you. Is that everyone of our panelists to talk for tonight?
I'll just say be kind. Appreciate that it's a vulnerable. One sentence, okay. The wordsmith here is failing. Embrace the vulnerability that it takes to learn and have an open mind.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all. And everyone, I release you from our custody. Everyone go get some sleep, and we at the AAP team wish you a good night. Thank you so much.